Hey, church, today we are in Luke chapter 7. And as you've probably noticed by now with Luke, there are long chapters, the way it's broken up. And so there's just a ton in each one. So we're just going to hit some of the highlights. It starts off by Jesus returning to Capernaum. Capernaum is a city on the Sea of Galilee. And it was Jesus' hometown. It was where he moved to the kind of his home base for his ministry. And Jesus' ministry is kind of broken up primarily in two different areas, primarily in the area of Galilee, and which is where Capernaum is, and then in Jerusalem. And so this is kind of, back and forth Jesus goes. But this is happening in Capernaum. That he ends up with two really remarkable miracles in this first half of Luke chapter 7. The first is centurion's servant. The centurion, if you remember, would have been a commander in the Roman legion. And this was the occupying force. These were the bad guys in the eyes of the Israelites. But this particular centurion was a godly man, a God-fearing man. And so the elders came and said, he's worthy for you to heal his servant. His servant had fallen sick. So Jesus starts off to his house, and along the way, the centurion comes and meets him and says, I'm not even worthy for you to come to my house, which there's sort of a cultural issue there, which is that Jesus, as an observant Jew, would have been really frowned upon to go into the home of a Gentile, would have been unclean. And so I think the centurion, kind of anticipating this dilemma that he thought Jesus might have, comes out and meets him. He says, look, I know I'm a commander of army. I tell my soldiers to do this, and they do it. If you command my servant to be healed, I know he'll be healed. Jesus commends him for his faith and heals the man. When the centurion comes home, his servant is completely healed. Then Jesus stumbles upon a funeral procession with a young man who had died. And it says in verse 14, he came upon and touched the coffin, and the bearers came to a halt, and he said, young man, I say to you, arise. The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. One of the wild things is that Jesus doesn't have some giant incantation and pray this really long prayer. He just says, young man, arise. And this man raises out of his casket, out of the coffin, and is raised to new life. That's just the power of Jesus. This kind of thing would have been happening all the time and during Jesus' ministry as you followed along. Then we get what I think is a really interesting story about John the Baptist, starting in verse 19. It says, summoning two of his disciples, John sent them to the Lord, saying, are you the expected one, or do we look for someone else? Now, this is really profound because if you remember, John had baptized Jesus, and when Jesus was baptized, John had confessed him as the Messiah, and he had heard the heavens open. The Holy Spirit descends on Jesus in the form of a bird, and he hears the voice of God the Father. This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And so John had already seen this miracle. John's whole life had been working towards preparing for, anticipating the ministry of the Messiah. If you remember, that John's disciples were trying to say, well, now Jesus is baptizing people, and that's kind of your thing, John. And John says, I must decrease so that he must increase. John was absolutely convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. Except now here he's sending his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one, or shall we wait for another? John is experiencing some doubt. What happened in John's life that caused him that doubt? Well, we know that John was arrested by Herod, a wicked king, a wicked and stupid king, and that John is sitting and languishing in the dungeon, in the prison of Herod, awaiting what ultimately will be his death in the most obscene, stupid ways, where a young girl is going to dance for Herod. He's going to say, I'll give you anything you want. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist. And that's how John the Baptist meets his maker. And so here John is in prison, and he sends his disciples to say, are you the one, or should we wait for another? Jesus says about John the Baptist that no greater man ever lived than John the Baptist. He was Jesus' cousin. He was a godly man. He was a prophet. And yet here he is, even him, struggling with doubt, because things aren't working out the way that he expected them to. He expected the Messiah to come and to be glorious and for him to share in the ministry of Jesus, of the Messiah, and now he's stuck in prison. And it's interesting to think about when things happen to us in our lives and we're expecting one thing to happen. We kind of have an expectation of how things are going to play out, what God is doing, and then God does something completely different. And all of us can come to those moments in our life where we doubt, Lord, are you there? Do you see us? What's going on? I want to commend a book to you that really focuses on just these few verses right here. It's called The Prisoner in the Third Cell by Gene Edwards. And he goes through this wrestling that John is doing with his doubt and Jesus' response to him. Jesus responds to his disciples in verse 22. He answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Notice what he doesn't say. John's question is, Jesus, are you the Messiah, or should we wait for another? Jesus doesn't say, yes, I'm the Messiah, John. He just tells him these things: the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them. And then Jesus ends it with this principle. He says, "Blessed is he who does not take offense at me." You know, what's interesting, the book, in Gene Edwards' book, The Prisoner in the Third Cell, and I'll put a link to the Amazon account if you want to purchase the book. I commend it to anybody who wants to listen to it or wants to look into it. But in that book, it deals with the Christian struggling with faith, where you have to just trust God. You don't get all the answers. If God was ever going to tell anybody the answer, it was John the Baptist, and Jesus doesn't even tell him. And it's this difficulty of walking by faith and trusting in him that we get to see even in John the Baptist wrestle with, that we oftentimes wrestle with. And there's some great encouragement in just Jesus saying, trust me, just believe in me. It goes on to say, Jesus goes on to talk about John the Baptist's ministry. And then we get a really, I think, an important verse in verse 31. Jesus says, "To what then shall I compare the men of this generation? What are they like? They are like children who sit in the marketplace and call to one another, and they say, 'We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not weep.'" He's saying this generation is like kids playing in the marketplace who are complaining that the game that they're playing, whether they're playing a marriage ceremony or a funeral ceremony, and the other kids won't engage and they won't play. And he says this generation is like this. And then he goes on to say these things. "For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." When John the Baptist came, they said he has a demon because he lived out in the wilderness and he lived a very austere life, a very humble life. Then Jesus came and he did his ministry, and he did eat and he did drink and he did spend time with sinners, and they rejected him because they said, "You're a gluttonous man, you're a drunkard," and they cast aspersions on him. What Jesus is saying is the real reason for rejecting John's ministry and the real reason for rejecting Jesus' ministry is not because you honestly approach him. It's because you're not playing the game we want you to play. You're not acting and doing the way that we want you to act and doing the things that we want you to do. And so the people found reasons to reject John, and they found reasons to reject Jesus. John didn't have a demon, and Jesus certainly wasn't a drunkard and a glutton. And yet people still rejected him. And one of the principles here is Jesus is saying, I don't buy, your accusations are insincere, and I don't believe them and I don't buy into them. Well, today, we have a lot of people who would say the same things about Christians. They would reject and say, you're hateful and you're bigoted and you're all these things. And the reality is because we're not doing the things you want us to do, and we're not acting the way you want us to act, you're finding a reason to reject us. You're finding a reason to reject the message of God. People want to tell God, they want to dictate to God the terms, and that's not how it works. God dictates the terms to us. Well, it goes on where Jesus goes and he has a dinner at a Pharisee's house, and there's a woman there who's a sinner. And so we can if the woman is defined by her sin, she's likely a prostitute, some woman of really bad reputation. And Jesus is sitting at the table. This woman brings an alabaster vial, and she pours this perfume on Jesus' feet, and she wipes his feet with her tears, and she's just weeping and crying. It's this big scene. And the Pharisee said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, for that she is a sinner. Jesus perceives what the Pharisee is thinking, and he tells him a parable. He tells him a story. He says, a money lender had two debtors, one who owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. So which of them will love him more? Really simple. One guy owes $500 and one guy owes $5,000. Okay? The guy they owe it to forgives them both. Who's going to love him more? And the Pharisee says, well, I guess the one who owed 5,000. And he says, truly you've said that. Since I've been here, in verse 44, He said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet with perfume. For this reason I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. You know, what's interesting is we think about the scriptures and we think about what the Bible teaches is all sin separates us from God. Every single one of us is a sinner. Every single one of us is a debtor, okay? But the woman perceived her debt to be so big that when it was washed away, when she was forgiven, her love and her gratitude, her thanksgiving overflowed in this expression of commitment, loyalty, and faithfulness to Jesus. By contrast, the Pharisee who sat back and judged and thought he had very little to be forgiven of, his response was not to respond at all the same way. In fact, he sat back in indignation and self-righteousness. So he stood aloof from Jesus. Now, here's the reality. All of us are sinners. All of us need to be forgiven. When we cast ourselves on Jesus, you experience the grace and the goodness of God to forgive us our sins. That's when you can really understand the love and power of God. And what is released inside of us is devotion and love to him. So, church, I encourage you today to celebrate God's forgiveness of you, to revel in it, to enjoy it, to love that God has washed you clean. God bless you, church.